Chinese police stations are a growing threat, but what do they actually do? Welcome to China Insider. I'm David Zhang. Before we get started, there's actually going to be a Zoom event that I'm very happy to promote because it's a talk with Paul Skousen, who is a professor that's written a great book called The Naked Socialist. Now, if you know his father, who is Cleon Skousen, his father wrote The Naked Communist book. Dr. Paul Skousen and his father, Cleon Skousen, for 30 years did the course on the American Constitution for Supreme Court justices, for senators, for Congress, and the idea is to teach about the deeper understanding of the American Constitution. Dr. Paul Skousen is doing this online talk based on his father's book, Miracle of America, which is basically focusing on how the American Constitution and the vision of the Founding Fathers really shaped the country. And some of the current social issues that we're facing today, what does that have to do with revitalizing the American society? Now, of course, we know that the threat of the Chinese Communist Party and the foreign issues, a lot of that is largely a reflection of the domestic instability. So with this talk, I hope that he can address the issues and the challenge there. But, you know, the fundamental idea is we understand America less than the adversaries and the enemies of America understands us, right? In 1991, the Chinese scholar, or now is a top CCP official, he wrote a book called America Against America. In that book, he systematically outlines all of the issues Americans face, how the government works, what flaws there are. So they've studied and really understood the issues and the downside or the bads of America. And so they're using all of those strategies today against us, right? So I think this talk will explore how to defend against threats, foreign and domestic. And so if you want to do it, it's on Eventbrite. I'll put the link in the description. It's going to touch on issues like the Constitution, the woke ideologies, socialism, all of these things happening in America. So the Zoom event will happen on May 27th, which is Saturday. And for $10, you can get the ticket and everybody in your family can watch. I definitely encourage that if you have any kids or teens in the home, make sure for them to watch this event as well. It's going to be in both Mandarin and English. Now, we're hearing a lot about the Chinese police stations overseas, but what exactly do they do? Well, in short, they harass dissidents, they try to persuade people to return to China, and they also engage in counter-protest. But that's just the basic parts of it. In some countries, like in Italy, there's actually Chinese police officers on the street, and they were invited to police the Chinese tourist and anything related to Chinese problems. But then in some other countries, like in the United States or Canada, the operation seems to be more covert in that it's not publicly acknowledged for a very long time until recently that these organizations or groups existed. According to a report from the Chinese government called Contribute China Power to a Safer World, Chinese police will actually show up to Rome in Italy, for example, to deal with the Chinese people there. And of course, Italy has since investigated these events as well as some of the other countries when exposed. But it's a really big question as to how seriously have they been hiding this from plain sight, that people haven't been realizing it for so long. Let's specifically talk about Canada and the United States because according to the Montreal Gazette, there's a nonprofit organization in Quebec who's been receiving government fundings from Canada for 3 years. And they're disguised as a family organization to help out the local Chinese diaspora, but in reality, they're actually engaging in soft power and in United Front operations. So according to the Montreal Gazette, the Service à la Famille Chinoise du Grand Montréal, or SFCGM, pardon my French, it's supposed to provide support to the Chinese community, but is really used by Beijing to monitor and intimidate citizens in Canada. They've received more than 4.5 million Canadian from the Canadian government over the last 3 years. And according to RCMP, they believe that this is one of the 2 secret police stations in Quebec, which has nearly 92,000 people of Chinese origin. Aside from those, we also know that there's 3 at least in Toronto and 2 at least in Vancouver, 2 major Canadian cities with a huge Chinese population. But breaking that down, there's actually 4 places in China that these police stations are corresponding to. They're all in southern China. But what exactly are the operational differences between the one we saw in Manhattan versus other ones in the United States? Well, according to the Safeguard Defender organization, which researches this, they believe that there's at least 6 police stations in the United States alone. The one we know is in Manhattan in Chinatown, but there's also another one in New York, one in Los Angeles, one in San Francisco, one in Houston, Texas, one in Nebraska, likely in Omaha, and one in Minnesota, likely in Minneapolis. The ones that we know are from LA, from New York City, are the ones that do control the physical aspect of policing and controlling the Chinese diaspora. But the other ones are more like the United Front organizations, which work to co-opt local areas, politicians, society, and aims to control and influence the opinions about Chinese leadership, as well as about how the U.S.-China relationship should formulate itself in this era. But with the more blatant ones, the ones that we saw where they arrested 2 of the leaders, they actually engage in things like coercion, harassment, counter-protest. For example, the one where Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen visited New York and in California. But they also do things like persuade people to return to China, and they also engage in protest against religious groups like Falun Gong in some of its activities in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere. Let's specifically talk about the ones in Manhattan and in Los Angeles. Those ones, they really target the vulnerability of the Chinese community. Many of them, because of language barrier, they have to deal with these so-called police stations. And some of them do things like renewal for passport, ID, or whatever banking situation they have going on in China. As well as many of the Chinese people living overseas, they actually work jobs so that they can bring money and send money back to China. And so the CCP can capitalize and target these people and say, if you want to continue to be able to send money back home, you have to do these things for us, or you have to follow the rules. Now, regarding with these openly physical locations, their goal is to, quote, resolutely crack down on all kinds of illegal and criminal activities involving overseas Chinese. In other words, if you are a part of a dissidence group, or if you speak ill of the Chinese government, like you're critics of the CCP, then the chance of you being targeted, and that also means your family back home could also become targets. But we do understand that, for example, the 2 were arrested in connection to the Manhattan police station. What they had done was engage in coercion, trying to intimidate Chinese dissidents living in the United States, spread pro-China propaganda, and undermine faith in American democracy. And the second type features operatives actually working in what's called the United Front Work Department. Now, this is a soft power attempt to co-opt power and influence. The CCP often calls these the overseas arm of its propaganda, as well as attempts at trying to change the perception of China, organizing the local community to do these cultural events, dances, celebrations, Chinese New Year events, and they try to influence a bigger community and then import the Chinese Communist Party ideologies into a front, say, Chinese cultural exhibition or history events or holidays or parades and things like that. Another one is trying to influence the local politics, whether that's electing people who are more pro-CCP or people that do want or have no idea that this is actually a Chinese Communist Party front. They just try to make it seem like they're integrated into this part of the community and have a speaking voice because many of them are actually American citizens and pay taxes. So there's a lot of ways in which they can already be in the American way of life without knowing it, but deep down changing it. From the reports, it seems that different parts of China's police bureaus are corresponded with different parts of the overseas police stations. So, for example, in one part, it organizes and commands and controls the European police stations, whereas the other parts do the North America, South America, Asia, and the rest of the world. And I believe this is a long-term process, so for us to get rid of everything overnight is not possible, but identifying it is the first step toward removing these influential parts of the CCP's overseas control of the Chinese community and the rest of the world. All right, that's it. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. And if you enjoy the content, please subscribe to our channel and like this video. And also comment below what your thoughts are on Chinese police stations overseas. All right, this is China Insider. We'll see you next time.